The war changes not because the heroes lose conviction, but because the villains finally abandon the habits that once made them vulnerable. The darkness stops posturing and starts governing. Ego gives way to coordination, and symbolism is replaced by logistics. Power is no longer wielded to intimidate, but to conclude. The moment emotion is removed from command, the outcome stops being a question and becomes a process. The villains understand what the heroes never fully accept, that the war was never meant to be dramatic. It was meant to be inevitable. Vast military production no longer waits for grand confrontations but grinds forward without pause. Fleets rotate instead of chasing glory, and commanders are rewarded for containment rather than spectacle. Victory is achieved through continuity, not climactic triumph. Every heroic success becomes temporary by design. A base destroyed a convoy, intercepted a leader assassinated, and within days replacements are already in motion. Resources scale infinitely on one side and episodically on the other. The imbalance is no longer hidden by narrative luck or delayed response. Momentum dies because it is smothered before it can compound. The villains replace reactive force with predictive dominance. Intelligence agencies map social networks, financial flows, and ideological clusters long before resistance turns violent. Cells are dismantled before they develop identity cohesion or operational memory. Arrests feel random to the public, but are surgically precise within the system. Resistance never matures because it is never allowed to become itself. Surveillance stops being a blunt instrument and becomes an ecosystem. Movement, communication, and supply chains are quietly tracked, rather than aggressively restricted. The illusion of freedom is preserved because overt repression is inefficient. Instead, the net tightens, invisibly reducing options without ever appearing to close. Control feels natural because alternatives quietly vanish. Heroic sacrifice loses its disruptive power. Acts that once would have inspired systems to rise are now anticipated and neutralized. Martyrs are buried in silence, their stories diluted by counter-narratives and algorithmic suppression. Courage still exists, but it no longer bends the arc of the conflict. Bravery becomes personal rather than strategic. The villains learn faster because they treat failure as data rather than insult. Every loss is dissected, refined, and absorbed into doctrine. No defeat is emotional, and no victory is over-celebrated. Adaptation becomes continuous while the opposition still waits for signs and symbols. The learning curve tilts permanently in one direction. Tradition becomes the hero's weakness. They rely on stories, tactics, and expectations that once worked against a less disciplined enemy. Hope substitutes for infrastructure, and faith replaces coordination. This mismatch widens over time rather than shrinking. The war is not lost in a moment, but in a pattern. Political control becomes airtight without appearing tyrannical. Legislation precedes enforcement, creating legality before resistance can react. Emergency measures are normalized quietly and repealed selectively to appear benevolent. The system evolves into something that cannot be opposed without sounding unreasonable. Authority does not argue, it simply proceeds. Public morale erodes not through terror, but through repetition. Each attempted uprising ends quickly, cleanly, and without visible impact. The population learns the rhythm of failure and adjusts expectations accordingly. Resistance stops feeling heroic and starts feeling irresponsible. Support fades not from fear, but from exhaustion. The villains no longer need symbols of terror, because predictability does the work for them. Stability becomes the brand and disruption becomes the crime. Life continues uninterrupted for most citizens, which reframes opposition as a threat to normalcy. Order becomes emotionally appealing because it removes uncertainty. This is power operating at its most efficient. What makes this outcome devastating is how rational it feels. Nothing collapses suddenly, and nothing burns dramatically. The system simply proves itself unmovable through consistency. Each year resistance costs more and yields less. Eventually even belief runs out of energy. The heroes are still brave, still principled, and still willing to die. But willingness is no longer enough against a machine that plans generations ahead. The gap between intention and outcome becomes impossible to ignore. At some point, sacrifice stops being noble and starts being wasteful. That realization spreads quietly. The villains win the war, not by becoming stronger, but by becoming patient. They stop needing to be feared and start being accepted. The galaxy adjusts itself around their permanence. Victory arrives without ceremony because it was never meant to be noticed. From here, the story does not end, but it changes shape. What follows is not resistance rising again, but a civilization learning to live inside defeat. If you want me to carry forward into how that acceptance takes hold and what it costs to survive, just say continue, and we will move ahead. Defeat does not arrive as an announcement or a final transmission declaring the end of resistance. It settles gradually into the culture, like gravity slowly increasing, until movement itself becomes effort. The galaxy does not wake up one day having surrendered, but instead adjusts its expectations downward year after year. Each failed uprising teaches the same lesson more efficiently than the last. Eventually people stop asking when victory will come and start asking how to live without it. The collapse of the rebellion is administrative rather than cinematic. Funding dries up as donors realize resources vanish without results. Safe worlds withdraw support quietly to avoid scrutiny and reprisal. Cells lose cohesion as infiltration breeds mistrust and coordination becomes dangerous. The movement does not fall apart because it is crushed, but because it cannot sustain itself under constant, invisible pressure. Public support erodes not through terror, but through proof. Every attempt at resistance ends the same way, with minimal disruption and maximum efficiency. Citizens see patterns where once they saw hope. Rebellion begins to look less like courage and more like recklessness. When failure becomes predictable, sympathy fades faster than fear ever could. Systems across the galaxy begin to comply because non-compliance offers no path forward. This is not surrender in the emotional sense, but adaptation in the biological sense. Governments prioritize continuity over ideals because continuity keeps people fed, housed, and employed. Compliance becomes framed as responsibility rather than betrayal. The language of survival replaces the language of freedom. Order fills the vacuum left by failed hope. Streets or safer trade routes stabilize, and violence becomes rare outside controlled zones. For many citizens, life improves in measurable ways even as something essential disappears. Comfort becomes the strongest argument for acceptance. When stability works, it dulls the memory of what was lost. This is how moral erosion truly functions. Not through cruelty, but through convenience. People learn to separate personal goodness from systemic injustice. As long as they are kind within their circles, the larger structure feels abstract and distant. Ethics shrink to scale because anything larger feels unchangeable. The system depends on this psychological narrowing to endure. The heroes do not vanish from history, but they are transformed by it. Their stories are preserved in controlled forms stripped of urgency and consequence. They become lessons about bravery without victory, sacrifice without reward. Children are taught to admire them, but never to imitate them. Courage is reframed as admirable, but impractical. Over time, these figures lose their sharp edges. Their failures are emphasized more than their ideals. They are remembered as sincere but misguided individuals who did not understand the world as it truly was. Mythology remains, but inspiration is neutralized. The past becomes safe because it no longer threatens the present. The most chilling realization is that nothing feels broken enough to justify rebellion again. The system functions and adapts and corrects minor failures before they metastasize. Injustice is real but dispersed and procedural rather than spectacular. There is no single moment to point to as intolerable. Outrage never reaches critical mass because it never concentrates. Power at this scale no longer needs villains with personalities. It operates through frameworks, incentives, and predictive enforcement. Individuals are interchangeable and therefore irrelevant. Blame becomes difficult because responsibility is everywhere and nowhere at once. This diffusion is what makes the system resilient. There is nothing to overthrow, only something to endure. The galaxy becomes quieter in every sense. Art becomes cautious, politics become technical, and language becomes careful. Passion is not forbidden, but it is redirected into safe channels. Creativity exists but avoids confrontation. Culture survives by learning where the invisible lines are and never testing them too hard. What makes this outcome unsettling is how reasonable it feels to those living inside it. People are not miserable enough to revolt and not free enough to dream boldly. Life occupies a narrow, functional band that discourages risk. Ambition shifts from change to comfort. This is not dystopia as spectacle, but dystopia as routine. The story ends without redemption, because redemption requires collapse, and collapse never comes. There is no final spark that reignites belief. Instead, there is acceptance rationalized as maturity and resignation reframed as wisdom. The galaxy convinces itself that this is the best outcome available. History does not close with triumph, but with accommodation. This version of events offers no catharsis, only clarity. It argues that overwhelming power, when applied intelligently, does not need to be cruel to be absolute. It only needs to be consistent, patient, and adaptive. Once those conditions are met, resistance becomes a memory rather than a threat. And the most frightening truth is that nothing about this outcome is implausible.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.